Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing, and Mr. Palmer, thank you for bringing a good piece of legislation forward. Thank you to our witnesses, and Mr. Cohn, I agree with you. There's nothing wrong with an amendment that would carve out the whistleblowers, much like Mr. Palmer's legislation already exempts the Patent Office and the Postal Service. But I want to try to get a handle on the overall picture here. So as I understand it, there are three major categories. There's fees, there's fines and penalties, and then there's settlements. Money that the people's representatives don't get a direct say on what happens with that money when it comes to the federal government. So, Director Krause, what is the total number, let's just go in that order, fees. What is the amount of fees collected in fiscal year 2017 by the federal government and all the various agencies?
Unfortunately, that number is unknown. When we've looked at issues particularly related to fees, government-wide sources don't necessarily track back to the specific legal authorities related to the
Here's what the President said. The White House said it was $534 billion. Are you familiar with that number?
I am not familiar with that number.
This is from their budget. For 2017, the table shows that total offsetting collections and offsetting receipts from public are estimated to be $534 billion. Do you accept that number?
I would have to take a look at it closer to understand it.
Is the White House right or wrong?
I don't, unfortunately, I don't.
Is it in the ballpark?
Like I said, when we have work ongoing.
For the sake of argument, let's accept what the White House said. It's their budget. It's, they're the head of the executive branch. They're saying it's $500. That's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. You know how much we spend in discretionary spending each year, or last year? You know how much we spent in discretionary last year?
I don't know that number.
$1.2 trillion. So we have a number that's collected in just fees, just 1/3 of the three areas. That's almost half of what we spend annually in discretionary spending. That's a pretty big number. It's that $534 billion is approaching what we spend on national defense each year. And again, the people's representatives in the United States Congress don't have a direct say on how that money is spent once it's collected, right? Let's move on to fines and penalties. Do you know how much we collect annually in fines and penalties?
I do not know that based on the data sources that are available.
Yeah, that's stuff we need to know, but the study the committee did over a 5-year period determined that number was $83 billion over a 5-year period. So again, we're talking billions of dollars. Now what's interesting and what the committee found out is Treasury couldn't give us any numbers. Specifically, Treasury and the IRS couldn't give us the numbers. This is the IRS. They collect a few fines and penalties. My guess is some amount. So then you have this $83 billion figure that excludes the Internal Revenue Service and any numbers coming from Treasury. And then finally you have the third category, settlements, which now we know settlements is a nice way of saying for some people, particularly when you think about the Justice Department, settlements is another word for a shakedown. Certain companies have reached a settlement with the Justice Department, and then they tell this particular company, it's not just about penalizing you or compensating the real victims. We want you to give money to some nonprofit that we deem as appropriate, and we're going to call it a donation. Interesting use of the word donation. So when you add all these together, could you even hazard a guess how much money in fees, fines and penalties, and settlements the federal government collects in 1 year?
As I had mentioned, when we've looked at this, there isn't a government-wide source that would allow us to give a reliable total on the amount.
So who can give us that number? I mean, this is what Mr. Palmer's legislation gets to the heart of. We can't even get someone in the federal government to tell us what that total number. We know fees, based on what the White House told us, is roughly equivalent to what we spend on national defense each year. It's roughly equivalent to half of all discretionary spending we did in 2017. We know it's a big number just in the fees category alone. But we'd like to know what it is, fees, fines and penalties, and settlements, what that number totals up to. So who can give us that number?
That is something, we have ongoing work looking at what we call backdoor spending authority, and it is to do an inventory of the accounts that are out there, the budget accounts that are out there for funding that supports outside of the.
Does anyone else in the panel know who? I mean, I would think Office of Management and Budget should be able to give us that number. I would think someone at the Treasury Department, the department in charge of the nation's money and how we, I would think someone there could give us that number. Why can't we get that number in an important hearing on an important piece of legislation that Mr. Palmer has brought forward?
Yes,
Mr. Hollister, looks like you want to offer
I sure do. Mr. Jordan, My understanding is that the Treasury Department's fiscal service has that information. It's maintained by the Central Accounting Repository Service, and that on the other hand, there
Well,
are...
Mr. Hollister, why won't they give that information to this nice lady over here, Director Kraus, so that she could come here today and give it to Mr. Meadows and this committee?
If I understand right, there are some organizational problems that exist between Treasury's Ledge Affairs Office and their fiscal service.
What does that mean?
That means that sometimes the fiscal service and the Ledge Affairs Office don't get along.
Does that mean they're just not going to, well, you know, Mr. Meadows is a nice guy, but we're not going to give him the information? Is that what they're saying?
Well, what it does mean is that the information that's in the President's budget that you cited and the information that's in the monthly Treasury statement that comes out every month that has at least a line item for miscellaneous receipts, that's coming from somewhere. It's coming from the system that Treasury maintains.
Yeah. Well, we'd like that information so that we can actually get moving on Mr. Palmer's legislation with the appropriate amendments like Mr. Cohn has offered. But this is exactly why the gentleman from Alabama is on the right track with an important piece of legislation. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.